I was 9 years old when it happened. My family had just moved to a small, sleepy village after my dad lost his job. Everything felt different there. The air, the quiet streets, even the way the trees seemed to lean in like they were watching. My parents said the move was for the best, that the slower pace would give us a fresh start. But to me, the village felt isolating, like the kind of place where people disappeared and no one noticed. It started out as just another day. I decided to take our dog, Max, for a walk down the narrow dirt road that led out of the village. Max was a wiry little mutt with boundless energy, and walking him gave me an excuse to escape the house. My parents were always tense back then, their hushed arguments a constant reminder of how bad things had gotten. Out on the road, though, it was just me, Max, in the open fields. The man appeared around a bend in the road. He was walking toward us, a tall figure in a dusty jacket, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. At first, he didn't seem out of place. Strangers weren't uncommon in the village. Farmers and delivery drivers passed through all the time. When he saw me, he smiled. A wide, toothy grin that felt forced, like he'd practiced it in front of a mirror. "Nice dog," he said, his voice gruff but friendly. "What's his name?" "Max," I replied cautiously. I didn't stop walking. Max growled low in his throat, which was odd. He was usually friendly with strangers. The man squatted down, patting his knee as if to call Max over. He looked strong. "Bet he's a good boy." His eyes flicked up to me. "Do you live around here?" Something about his tone made me uneasy. It wasn't the question itself. It was the way he asked, like he was probing for something. I lied, telling him I didn't live nearby and that I was just visiting. My parents always told me to be wary of strangers, and this man was setting off every alarm in my head. "Really?" he said, standing up. "I thought I saw you around before." My heart sank. He was watching me. I mumbled something about needing to get home and tugged Max's leash, trying to move past him. But the man stepped closer, his smile fading. "Wait a minute," he said. "I need some help. My car's just down the road. It broke down, and I can't push it on my own. Could you give me a hand?" Max barked sharply, pulling back on his leash. The man's eyes darkened, and I knew then that something was very, very wrong. Before I could answer, he grabbed my arm. His grip was iron strong, and the world tilted as he yanked me off the road. Max barked and snarled, but the man kicked him away with a vicious sweep of his boot. I screamed, thrashing, but there was no one around to hear me. The last thing I remember before everything went black was Max's frantic barking, growing fainter as the man dragged me into the bushes. When I woke up, I was in a dark, dusty room. The air smelled damp and metallic, like rust and old blood. My head throbbed, and my wrists ached where the rope bit into them. For a moment, I thought it was a bad dream, until I saw the bathroom door slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of something that froze my blood. Bones. Small fragile bones piled in the corner, the white stark against the grime. Then, everything went black again. When I woke up again, my head was clearer, and the panic hit me like a freight train. My wrists were tied, the rope digging into my skin, but it was loose enough that I could feel some give. The room was dark except for a faint sliver of light streaming through a high, boarded-up window. The air felt thick, and every sound seemed amplified. My ragged breathing, the creak of the floorboards above, and the occasional muffled thud. I didn't know where he was, but I knew he'd be back. I wriggled my wrists, twisting and turning until the rope started to give way. My fingers burned as I pulled harder, desperation outweighing the pain. After what felt like forever, the rope slipped free. My heart pounded as I crept toward the door, every step feeling like it could give me away. The door wasn't locked, which surprised me. Maybe he didn't think a kid could escape. I pushed it open slowly, wincing at the creak, and peered out into a dim hallway. The house, or whatever this place was, smelled like mildew and rot. My bare feet patted softly on the floor as I moved, trying to stay silent. I passed another room, and through the crack of the door, I saw a table covered in tools. Not normal tools. Rusty blades, pliers, and things I didn't recognize. My stomach churned, and I quickly looked away. I was almost to the front door when I heard footsteps. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice froze me in place. I turned and saw him standing at the other end of the hallway, his shadow stretching toward me. He wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes were cold, calculating, and furious. "And get back here," he growled, taking a step forward. I ran. The front door was locked, but I spotted a window to the side. Without thinking, I grabbed a wooden chair and swung it at the glass. The sound of shattering glass filled the room as I scrambled through the opening, cutting my arm on the jagged edges. I didn't stop. I sprinted into the woods, branches clawing at my face and arms, the ground uneven beneath my feet. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush, shouting for me to stop. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they would give out, but I kept running. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. Eventually, the sounds of his pursuit faded, but I didn't stop. The forest seemed endless, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels. I stumbled into a clearing and fell to my knees, gasping for breath. That's when I saw him. A man walking along a dirt path with a backpack slung over his shoulder. He looked up, startled, when he saw me. "Hey kid, are you okay?" I couldn't speak. I just stared at him, tears streaming down my face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling down. He looked at the blood on my arm and the scratches on my face. "What happened?" "A man," I managed to choke out. "He took me." His face darkened. "Where? Where is he now?" "I don't know," I whispered. "He was chasing me." The man looked around, scanning the woods. "We need to get out of here. Come on." He took my hand and led me back to the dirt path. His grip was firm but gentle, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of safety. He didn't ask too many questions, just kept me moving until we reached a road. A small gas station sat at the edge of the woods. The man used the payphone to call the police, keeping a watchful eye on the trees. When the police arrived, everything felt like a blur. They asked me questions, but I couldn't focus. All I wanted was to see my parents. They brought me to the station, and when I saw my mom and dad already there, I broke down completely. My mom pulled me into her arms, crying harder than I'd ever seen her cry. My dad held us both, his face pale and drawn. "Where were you?" My mom kept asking, "What happened to you?" I didn't have the words to explain. All I could do was cling to them and sob. It had been a few weeks since everything happened, but life hadn't gone back to normal, not even close. My parents didn't let me out of their sight, not even to play in the yard. Every time I caught my mom looking at me, her eyes were red and puffy, like she'd been crying. My dad, who always seemed so steady, kept pacing the house, jumping at every sound. One evening, the phone rang. My dad answered, his voice low and tense. My mom and I sat at the kitchen table, watching him as he spoke. His face grew paler with every word. When he finally hung up, he turned to us, his mouth tight and his eyes hard. "They got him," he said. My mom gasped and clapped her hands over her mouth. "The man," she whispered. Dad nodded, sitting down heavily in his chair. "The police found him in a shack not far from where they picked you up," he said, looking at me. He had things in there, evidence. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know, but Dad kept talking. He's been doing this for months. They've connected him to other kids who went missing in towns around here. Dad's voice broke and he shook his head like he couldn't go on. How many? Mom whispered. Dad looked at her, then at me. His voice was barely audible. 2 before him. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. 2 kids who didn't escape. 2 kids who didn't make it home. My mom pulled me into her arms, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. But I didn't complain. I didn't want her to let go. The next few days were a blur of news reports and police visits. I overheard things I wish I hadn't. They said the man would lure kids, just like he'd lured me, and that the bones in the bathroom had been real, and some of them belonged to kids my age. The thought made me sick to my stomach. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that room, smelled the damp rot of the walls, and heard the sound of his voice calling after me. Even though they'd caught him, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there. At night, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the house making my heart race. My parents tried to shield me from it all, but the looks on their faces said everything they didn't. Relief that I was alive, yes, but also guilt, fear, and something darker, an understanding of how close I'd come to being one of those two. The police called me a hero for escaping, but I didn't feel like one. I felt lucky, and that luck haunted me. Why me? Why not one of the others? Even now, years later, I still think about that man and that room. I think about the 2 kids who didn't make it and wonder if they were as scared as I was. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run fast enough, if I hadn't found that traveler, if the killer had caught me before I smashed the window. I don't think those questions will ever go away, but I'm here. I survived, and for that, I'm grateful, even if the memories never let me forget how close I came to being one of the 2.